From New Hampshire Public Radio and the Howe Library in Hanover, New Hampshire, you're listening to Check This Out, a new literary series where we dive deeply into the works of emerging and diverse authors you may not have discovered yet. I'm your host, Rachel Barenbaum, author of the novel Atomic Anna. I am thrilled to be able to share these conversations with you over the next few weeks. Later in the series, we'll be hearing from Aubrey Lescure, Ingi Artek, and more. But today, my guest is Leo Vardiashvili. He is the author of the brand new novel, Hard by a Great Forest. It is his debut novel. It is set in the former Soviet Republic of Georgia, and he takes us to the country through a character named Saba, who escaped the Civil War in the 90s and fled to London. Now in his 20s, he returns, searching for his father and brother who have both disappeared. Saba's journey is haunted. He's accompanied by ghosts that help and hurt, and he faces the trauma he experienced during the war and tried to leave behind. He also takes us through big swaths of the country, of gorgeous Georgia countryside and cities, where we hear how the war affected so many, leaving soil soaked in blood. It's dark, but there is light, and there is love, and there is hope. Much of this narrative is based on Leo's own life. He fled to Tbilisi, Georgia, when he was 13 and sought asylum in London. For complicated asylum reasons, it took him more than 15 years to get the passports and paperwork ready to return. And when he did, he realized the pain of returning to a country you can no longer recognize is part of the invisible, private toll that all wars take on those fortunate enough to survive them. Leo, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Rachel, for having me. It's a privilege.
You have been very clear that you wrote this book because you wanted to face the trauma that you survived, that you beat, and you wanted to show that you are coming out smiling like so many Georgians, right? To show us that Georgia is also smiling and facing this trauma. It sounds dark, but it's also beautiful, and there is lots of love in this book. Can you talk about that personal connection, that darkness that you wanted to face in writing this book?
My main character is quite similar to me in his history, in that we both lived through the Civil War in Georgia and left for the UK as refugees and didn't get to return to Georgia for, nearly 20 years. So in that sense, we share a history. Obviously, my homecoming to Georgia was willing. I was a willing homecomer. My main character is unwilling. He doesn't want to go back. But in terms of trauma, what I wanted to talk about in the novel is this kind of family level trauma that gets left behind by war, conflict, and just being displaced. Something as simple as, moving to another country can have effects that play out over generations. And I feel like that stuff gets left out. I feel like our attention span and the media's attention span just moves from conflict to conflict and leaves behind a gap for fiction to fill in. So hopefully I've done that with the book.
You have. But I really want to lean into this idea that you have talked about, written about, is this private toll that wars take on those fortunate enough to survive them. And how do you think about that private toll?
Well, the private toll could be any number of things. It could be the relatives, like for Saba. It could be the people you didn't get to see again. It could simply be another version of your life that you could have had in the place that you left. You may have been at school, you may have been studying towards something, and suddenly you've had to move and uproot your life. So it's that subtle level trauma that I'm talking about.
Yeah. And I just want to be clear for listeners who haven't read the book yet. This is a hard book to read because, you really face the war that you experienced firsthand, but there is light. And there is love in this book, and you really wanted to show that smiling on the other side, as you called it, that Georgians experience and show and that you feel, and I would love to hear you talk about that.
Yeah, because of Georgia's history, it's a country that's been invaded over 30 times, or at least the capital has. So you've got to have a sense of humor to live through that kind of thing. And Georgians have a great sense of humor. It's almost like laughing in the face of any hardship that comes their way. And I really tried to get that into the novel through the characters, that no matter how bad things are, if you can still find the funny in it, it hasn't beaten you yet.
So let's set the scene because we are talking about living through a war, but what war? What time period? Where are we? What has Georgia gone through when the book opens and you drop us into the world of Saba?
So the events that displaced the characters to the UK, that's the fall of Soviet Union. So that's 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed, or at least Georgia fell away from the Soviet Union. And that kicked off a civil war in Georgia, which wasn't a particularly lengthy civil war. What had more of an effect on Georgia was the absence of any kind of government, the complete chaos of having a government for 70 years and suddenly no one owns this, public businesses and public factories, and the fighting that, as you can imagine, went over that. It just meant that the country was a chaos and there weren't really going to be any prospects for a few years. So that's what the characters escape. They escape the immediate civil war. In my own personal life, I stayed in Georgia for the Civil War, but we left shortly after in 1995.
And where were you during the Civil War?
Oh, I lived 20 minutes away from the Parliament building, which was the epicenter of the Civil War, if you want to call it that. Yeah.
So when you're writing about bombing, bullets flying, right, these things, this is firsthand knowledge that you were writing about.
Absolutely. Obviously, some of it has been exaggerated. I didn't have a tank shell fly past my window. But the gunfire at night and seeing the tracer rounds in the sky like fireworks, that's definitely something I've seen from a balcony. So, yeah, unfortunately.
Leo, could you introduce us to this book, to this world, Hard by a Great Forest, and, set the scene, open the book. Could you read for us?
Of course, this is the very beginning of the book. Where's Eka? We must have asked 1,000 times. Our mother stayed so that we could escape. See, war trumps most things. You'll find that a volley of AK-47 rounds fired right down your street will override almost any other concern. We heard gunfire by night and saw brass twinkling in the pavement in the morning, as though they had rained shell casings all over Tbilisi. Sounds manageable so far, but when a stray tank shell breaks the sound barrier by a bedroom window, screams on, and deletes the corner grocery shop and the entire family living above it, you'll begin to make plans. Our parents, Irakli and Eka, made plans to get us all out. Divorce be damned. Getting out of the country meant shady bribes, stolen travel stamps, and counterfeit certificates. What money the family scratched together was barely enough for one parent and us children. Eka didn't even have a passport. Together, we couldn't leave the country.
So there you just plop us right into the middle of the war, right into the middle of the family, and that wound, that pain. You know that two boys and the father are leaving, and the mother is going to be left behind.
Absolutely, yeah. Throwing you straight into the deep end, setting out the stall straight away, yeah.
Yeah. This felt very personal to me. It felt like something that you have lived through, like something you have witnessed.
In a way, yes. Not exactly the same, but for example, my grandmother, when I left in 95 and went back eventually, 15, 16 odd years later, my grandma had passed away by then and we were very close. So basically, I didn't get to see her because of all this. And I suppose that's the seed for the mother in the novel. It's that feeling of never getting to see someone you love again.
So there's a hard balance, I imagine, when you're writing a book like this between putting your emotions and your heart on the page, but also separating from the character because Saba is not all you. So how did you think about that as you were writing?
It happened naturally. Like I said, the beginnings of our stories are the same, Saba and me. But as soon as he lands in Tbilisi, and there's escaped zoo animals, and the police are following him, and there's a breadcrumb trail, his dad's missing, all of that. That's where our paths diverge. Obviously, he's a very different person from that point onwards, and his return to Georgia is very different.
So just to be clear for everybody listening, you have gone back. You've been back several times, right?
I go back at least twice a year. Yeah, I do.
And here in the book, in Hard by a Great Forest, we are watching Saba go back for the first time. And he's going back because his father and his brother have gone back and they've gone missing. They have different reasons for going back. They're searching for different people themselves. One of the first characters that Saba meets when he arrives at the airport, he comes out. He's coming off of the plane. It's his first time being back in this country since he was a kid, and Nodar approaches. Tell us about Nodar.
Well, no doubt was so much fun to write, by the way. He is an amalgamation of all the taxi drivers I've had in Tbilisi over the years. And most of them are experts on at least one topic, and it's usually politics. And they're usually also, as a requirement to being a taxi driver in Tbilisi, they're funnier than most comedians, honestly. So it's always a fun ride in a taxi in Tbilisi. So I wanted to bring that out, the humor in that, and I also wanted to make Nodar the kind of quintessential Georgian character. So the kind of stuff that you will see in travel guides about Georgia, about this idea of hospitality and kindness to strangers in Georgia. So I wanted to bring that out in Nodar and his wife also.
But I also read between these characters, I felt that there was a love, a familial kind of love, right? A brotherly love, that Nodar really takes Saba under his wing. And at first, maybe there's some false pretenses, but over time, I felt like a real love actually grew between them.
Yeah, I think they become companions on an adventure. Um, Nodar is a refugee in this as well. So they have that connection too. He's actually a refugee from the South Ossetia conflict, which is 2008 is when that happened. So he's a more recent refugee, but the experience is there, it's shared. So they make a bond.
If you're just joining us, I'm Rachel Barenbaum. You're listening to Check This Out on NHPR. And my guest today is Leo Vardiashvili. We are talking about his brand new debut novel, Hard by a Great Forest. And we are just diving into the story. We are talking about Saba, who arrives in Tbilisi, and he meets the taxi driver, Nodar. And they are off on an adventure. And they see a lot of ghosts. I feel like I need to talk about ghosts with you. There are some, actual ghosts. There are the Soviet ghosts. And I want to start with the Soviet ghosts because the city itself is a sort of character in here. The buildings, right, in Saba's mind, he imagines a Tbilisi, a Sololaki, which is his neighborhood that is different from what he's seeing. And the buildings, some have been torn down, destroyed by war, right? There's sort of this landscape is a big part of how we are introduced to the story and the city. So tell us about that.
Well, I imagine going back to a country that you left like that um, will have emotional landmines, if you want to call them that. I think I do in the novel at some point. That Saba feels like there's landmines waiting for them. And I guess this is shared by anyone that's gone back to their hometown or their old school. Is that feeling of how am I going to feel when I see this thing that I remember from my childhood? Is it going to be a happy experience? Am I going to cry? It's that sort of feeling, but obviously for the purpose of the novel, it's exaggerated a bit and blown up a bit.
And Saba is there reliving parts of his childhood because he's searching for his father and his brother. But he's there with a sort of escape hatch, I thought of it, right? He is now a British citizen. He has a passport that it can get him out. And yet when he arrives, it is taken away. And Nodar says to him, "How could you let them take it?" And so right away, right, he's walking through the streets and I'm nervous for him. I'm scared for him without that passport.
I guess I was born in the Soviet Union, and this might be a Soviet Union thing, but I always remember the adults when I was a kid that you didn't give up your passport for anything. That was the number one thing because that was your identity, and it was more than that. It just you literally, like Nodar says in the book, you don't give it up without a fist fight.
Yeah. And yet he did. He gave it up because he's a little bit clueless.
He's a little bit naive, yeah. He just handed it over without realizing that he didn't get it back. He leaves leaves the airport. So yeah, he goes through a journey that changes him, mind you, by the end of the book. But to start with, Sabo is very naive, yeah.
Yeah. And I thought that you really started this journey and this, sort of the introducing us to the first ghost when he goes, he's in a forest on this scavenger hunt, and we see an old Soviet-era bomb shelter. And it's decrepit, right? And he remembers as a kid playing around in there. But you see that remnant is still there. So, I'm thinking he has no way out. He doesn't have a passport, and he's stuck in the Soviet bomb shelter looking for his way. You really put him in the dark, literally, in that moment and start him off. So can you tell us about that, your thinking around that as a way to start?
Well, they really do, they do say you have to throw everything you can at your character, make them have a really bad time, and then have them climb their way out of that. So I guess that's what I was doing. Taking his passport away was actually quite a late addition to the draft. Um, Initially, he just turned up in Georgia, and he felt like he had to stay because he was looking for his brother and he was looking for his missing dad. But I thought taking his passport away also and literally trapping him might have a better effect. So that stayed in the draft.
I mean, it was a very powerful moment, and he has a stranger of sorts, Nodar, who's then the only person that he knows and the only person who's looking after him.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's the Georgian hospitality. That's happened to me more than once in Georgia, where I've been either lost or stranded somewhere, and someone a complete stranger will take you in and help you out. It's quite a common thing over there. There's a phrase that keeps coming up in the novel, which is a guest is a gift from God. So that's an actual Georgian proverb, and I did my best to translate it. It's a lot more elegant in Georgian. It's only 2 words, but I guess this a gift from God is the best I could do in English. But it really is a national mantra. They genuinely live by that.
Can you say it for us, the 2 words?
Stumari mertisa. The first word is guest, and the second word is of God. So it sounds nicer in Georgian, if that makes sense.
Saba is a guest that Nodar is taking care of. He's taking him under his wing, and he is on a scavenger hunt that his brother has sent him on. He is going all over Tbilisi looking for clues so he can find his father and his brother. And along the way, he starts to hear voices. And the voices are people from his past. I call them ghosts. And they're with him. They're his constant companions. Tell us about these voices.
Well, to give the voices a little bit of a fuller context, Saba mentions this in the beginning. He started talking to these voices willingly, almost as a coping mechanism for his family that passed away while he wasn't there. But he quickly realizes that he's talking to caricatures, I think he calls them, crude caricatures of his actual friends and family that passed away. So he quickly decides that he should stop, probably healthier to stop talking to them. And he does. But when the novel begins and he gets kind of dunked headfirst into Georgia, unwillingly, I might add, the voices come back too, and kind of without his permission this time.
I'm Rachel Barenbaum. You're listening to Check This Out on NHPR, and my guest today is Leo Vardiashvili. He is the author of the debut novel, Hard by a Great Forest. Leo, we are digging into the voices that Saba hears as he is on his scavenger hunt, as he is going through the city that he used to know. He's getting to re-know the city, right? This new version of himself and of the city. Let's talk some more about these voices that are in his head and what they mean to him.
Well, we mentioned that they were a coping mechanism for him, just to have some kind of contact with the people they didn't get to see after he escaped Georgia. But as the novel gets into more perilous territory, shall we say, without spoiling things, the voices take on almost like an agency, power over Saba. So they're able to make him do things or coerce him into doing things. I should mention also that not all the voices are benign. Some of them seem to have their own agenda and their own secrets, which again, I won't spoil anything here, but there's one voice in particular that seems to be hiding a secret.
Yeah, and it's very powerful because through this secret, through the voices, we feel his guilt. Guilt for a number of things, for escaping the country, for escaping death. One of the things that these voices and these ghosts make him realize is that death can have no meaning. And you give us this scene where he remembers a kid trying to reach a flower over a big gorge, and he goes to reach for the flower, and then he just slips and falls, and he's dead But, if he had fell 6 inches to the right, he would have been in the water or something. But instead, he's just dead. Let's hear about that scene.
Unfortunately, that's how death sometimes is. And especially if we're tying it back to the theme of war, it is often meaningless. A stray shell, it doesn't land where it's supposed to land, and you have a whole building that's demolished, full of innocent people. So I think that's the feeling I was trying to get to, making it more personal for Saba as well.
Because we also see another character. I don't want to give away too much, but there is a character who also maybe is hit with a bullet by an inch or two, right? If she had been shoved the other direction instead of the direction that she was pushed in, maybe she would have missed it. And we see the same kind of death, which just happens and is just meaningless and heartbreaking at the same
Yeah.
time.
Yeah, I feel like too much of life is ruled sometimes by just dumb luck. And it feels like it's a cheat. It shouldn't be that way, but it is, unfortunately.
And so, how do you think of this survivor's guilt for Saba? How do you think that he is carrying it and dealing with it in the book?
I don't think he is very well, to be honest. I think that's what the journey is about for him. Uh, on arrival, as I said, he's quite naive. He's emotionally vulnerable to this trauma that he's been through, but I don't think he's really processed it. And the voices are a symptom of that, I suppose. So the novel is, in a way, Saba processing this trauma and this survivor guilt.
Yeah. And you draw a parallel to it, a pretty strong one to Hansel and Gretel, which, you do through the title of the book itself. Can you talk about that parallel and how you put that in for Saba?
Yeah, I'm actually kind of hoping that people pick up the book and don't quite realize what the title means until they get to the part of the book where it becomes quite clear that it's Hansel and Gretel that we're talking about. And then they mentally go back to the title and go, oh, that makes sense now. I get it. That's quite cool. I'd quite like that. But the fairy tale, the breadcrumb element comes into it because Irakli, the father, goes missing. He seems to have left the trail, and then Saba's brother as well goes looking for the father. Um, and as a way of dodging the police and the attention that they seem to be having for some reason, he builds this breadcrumb trail. So the idea is that I'm signaling to you that you're about to go on an adventure. There's a breadcrumb trail that you might be able to follow back out, but it's not an adventure without danger.
It is deadly. It's terrifying, but it's also masked as a sort of right in the way fairy tales mask these kinds of adventures as something for kids, and maybe that there's some kind of fun in it.
It's mind blowing that these fairy tales, especially the kind of pre Disney, pre sanitized fairy tales like the Brothers Grimm, were written and read to children. Like I had them read to me. But if you really think about it, Hansel and Gretel is a pretty grim tale. There's murder in it, there's cannibalism, there's starvation, all sorts of horrible things.
Right. It is amazing. We think of that as a story for children. And yet
Yeah.
here it is, right? You're sort of borrowing parts of that or, laying on top of that story here, a very adult tale about war.
Yeah. And I think I was very conscious that the main themes, the heart of the book is quite serious and dark. And I was conscious of it not making it depressing. So I was always aware of trying to have elements of hope in it and something to laugh about. A lot of the time, it's no dark swearing, it provides comedy relief, but you need something to balance the dark themes.
If you're just joining us, you're listening to Check This Out on NHPR. My guest today is Leo Vardiashvili, and we are talking about his debut novel, Hard by a Great Forest. Right now, we are talking about fairy tales, and we are talking about Hansel and Gretel. And also, I want to pull us a step further into another fairy tale or biblical tale. We have a flood that then leads to these animals who escape from the zoo, and they are all over Tbilisi, right? They're all over the city, and they pop up in different ways. Tell us about this flood and these animals.
I wish I could tell you I invented that element of the book, but unfortunately, that actually did happen. In 2015, there was a flash flooding in the city. So the Tbilisi City Zoo happens to be along the river. So the flash flooding kind of broke all the fences in the zoo and literally just set free all the animals into the city. So it's worth a quick Google, by the way. There's some crazy pictures out there of literally hippos in the streets and wolves running around in shopping centers. The Bengal tiger did really escape. It took a while to find him and get him back, and so on. So I didn't have to invent that. I just saw that on a news website, and I thought, I can't. I've got to have this in my book. And it kind of represents the idea of this fairy tale, almost tugging at the edges of the real world.
I mean, it's a perfect metaphor.
It is, and someone made a connection that I hadn't made, and I wrote the book, which was very nice. It was a review I read recently, and the idea was that these zoo animals are also refugees. They find themselves in a new environment, a little bit like Saba does. And I thought, wow, that's a great connection to make.
It's true, but also there's a softness to animals running around, we think, and yet they're also dangerous. A tiger is beautiful to look at, and you think of a stuffed tiger as a toy in a kid's bedroom, and yet the tiger is going to literally pull Saba apart when he is in the cemetery.
Yeah, yeah. He's inches from death. I guess anyone is when they're near a tiger without a fence in between.
But it is a perfect mirror for the Hansel and Gretel, right? The fairy tales. We've got these stories in here. And like they say, you can't make the stuff up. It's real.
You can't, and I can't tell you how much fun it was taking that true story and then embellishing it a little bit and making it seem more like a fairy tale. It's so much fun to do.
Yeah. So another piece that I wanted to ask you about that's in the book was you talk about the police stations because Saba is being followed by the police and he's dragged in by this detective. And the police stations themselves, you talk about, are rebuilt and they're all glass. And the idea was that people could see through the glass, they would trust the police and feel safer with them. But they are built on top of the old Soviet era police stations, right? And the sort of catacombs, the torture rooms are still underneath, the solitary cells. So you have those two layers. And I wanted to ask you about the inspiration for that and the use of that in the story.
For the record, the police stations being made of glass is a real thing. I believe that the Georgian president around that time decided to bring in. And I think it's a great idea. It really did work in Georgia because for a long time, police corruption was an issue. And he was trying to clear the name of the police. And that really did take a step towards that. So in real life, it did work. For the purposes of the novel, artistic license and all that, not all of these glass police stations have old Soviet cells beneath them. One or two of the old ones do. And I thought it would be a nice contrast to have the, glass and chrome, brand new shiny building upstairs. And meanwhile, downstairs, you have these magic cells, as they used to call them. Magic because they used to make people disappear down there.
Terrifying. I mean, again, it was part of the fairy tale. It was like, I could see the old witch saying, come into my cabin, right? I'll make you delicious candy, right? Come into the police station. Let me just show you downstairs. That parallel was brilliance on your part to put those in there. I'm Rachel Barenbaum. You're listening to Check This Out on NHPR. And my guest today is Leo Vardiashvili. He is the author of the debut novel, Hard by a Great Forest. And we are talking about ghosts and fairy tales and voices. And another voice that floats throughout the book comes from the radio. And there's this radio station that Saba hears when he's in the taxi with Nodar for the first time, and it floats throughout the book. Tell us about this radio station, Leo.
Well, I heard that it's an actual radio station that used to exist. I'm not sure if it still does in Georgia, but it certainly did. Around the Soviet days and the end of Soviet days. And it's essentially a radio station where you can call in and leave a message. I'm told by my mum that it was a way to get messages in and out of prison. But in the novel, it serves the same function. You can send anonymous messages that can be decoded by the receiver and no one else. And it's the dad communicates with his two sons at certain points in the novel.
But we hear people communicating throughout. Could you give us some examples of some of the messages that we hear on the radio station?
A lot of them are romantic messages saying, if you want to meet up with me, I love you, so-and-so, let's meet up at this place. So it can be that level of kind of silliness. Some of the messages are more serious, like I said, with, you know, the Irakli trying to communicate with his sons on where he is or what he's doing.
Right. And so Irakli, the father, says, "Don't follow me. Right? Don't come. It's not safe." And he's been saying that the entire time. And yet Saba is still coming and he's still pushing forward. And eventually he finds out that maybe the breadcrumbs, the scavenger hunt, are leading him up to a monastery. And we have this great journey out of Tbilisi, right? And up into the mountains. And this is another opportunity where you tell us about the history of people who have crossed over there and been caught in the crosshairs of history.
Yeah, I mean, historically, Georgia is a country that's been invaded a lot, um, to the point where there's like a repeating strategy, um, defending the country and its culture, which is to um, give the city away and um, escape to the mountains, basically, which is the village you're talking about is Ushkoli. Um, it's one in a series of villages in the mountains, which is basically a final stand. If the enemy reaches you there, you've got your back to the mountains. You're not going to be. There's nowhere to run. So that would be the final stand, and that's where a lot of Georgian art, poetry, just cultural heritage stuff would end up um, away from the invaders.
Can you be more specific? What do you mean by that, that it would end up there?
So it would literally be carried by people from all over the country to the most remote part of Georgia, which would be in the mountains and be hidden there from the enemy. The idea being that if the enemy is eventually repelled, which it was 30 times or so, we could return these things back to where they were and continue being Georgian.
So, your characters, you are very good in this novel about taking things away from them slowly, right? And we mentioned that you start by taking Saba's passport and he shows up, and then you take more and more away as we go. And yet they still keep pushing forward. Saba keeps pushing forward. Nodar keeps pushing forward. He's also searching for someone and hoping that he will still find her, right? There's still this leg of hope that they are standing on. Talk to us about that and how they hold on to that.
I guess, again, trying to introduce the reader to the Georgian mentality of grinning in the face of hardship. Um, as long as there's the tiniest bit of hope left, there's still hope. So you should keep pursuing it, and that's what I was trying to get at, especially with Nodar, the person he's looking for. Finding that person is so unlikely that it's ridiculous. Yet there he is, and his whole life is centered around this pursuit anyway, because there is still that tiniest sliver of hope, and he's happy to live with that.
But how did you think about writing that hope into the characters in a way that people could recognize and continue rooting for them? Because in some ways, as a reader, you could say, there were moments where I could say to Saba, "Oh, all right already. Get your passport, try to go home." But I would never want him to do that. I kept rooting for him to keep going because he held on to this hope. So how did you think about, sort of imbuing that into the character?
I think it's a piece of advice that I got from a friend of mine who's also a writer. And the advice was, if you can't say it well enough as the writer, have the character say it. So I tried as much as possible to have Nodar and Saba express why they want to keep going. Nodar, in particular, he's very adamant about why he wants to keep looking for the person that he's looking for, and the same for Saba. And it almost feels like a sleight of hand trick, um, to have the characters do my talking for me. But that's what it is have the characters say it.
So when we get up into the mountains, I've been dying to ask you, have you been up there? Have you hiked it or have you driven it? I mean, I felt like you knew that area and that landscape so well.
I've been to Ushguli a couple of times now, just in terms of taking my friends there or going up there myself for the first time. And the village I based the description on is literally quite a small village, but every building in that village is a tower. So it's several stories high, with archways for shooting arrows out of, essentially. So every home is something to be defended because it is the last stand. And like I said, that village that I went to, Ushguli, is one of many like that, scattered across the mountains.
I just felt like that was the moment really where hope stood out the strongest, when they get up there. And at this point, you literally take everything away from them. They have, almost nothing, and they still keep running.
That is, it's where the breadcrumb trail runs out. There are no more clues to follow at that point. So they are literally stripped of everything. But again, pulled ahead by Nodar's enthusiasm and his kind of almost blind hope, they decide to continue anyway, because what else are you going to do? You can't just give up.
And also, this is really where I felt the love come in, the love for each other. They're looking out for each other. They need each other to do this, to be on the journey together. And this is why I say it's not a romantic love story, but there is a real love, a real bond that I felt in that moment when we're up there.
Absolutely. They are, at that point, their lives are linked for good. And no matter what happens later down the line, they're companions for life.
Leo, I want to ask you more about the process of writing this book because it is so personal for you. How did you think about how much of yourself to put in there? Did you pull back at any point?
I think the early drafts were a lot more autobiographical than the finished product is. And I did certainly consciously pull back because I didn't want this to be a memoir. I wanted it to be entertaining at the end of the day. So yes, I did pull back to the point where it's just the beginnings. The setting up of the characters is from my own history. And what happens after that is basically pure fiction, with the odd anecdotes here and there from my own life kind of carefully placed in there.
But you really did put your heart on those pages. And this is right where you were born. I feel like, this city is very, very dear to you, this country. And I'm wondering what you want your readers to take away from the novel.
In terms of Georgia, I do love the country. I might be biased, but I think it's definitely worth a visit. This Hard by Great Forest is a work of fiction. They don't take your passport away when you arrive, I promise you. We've got the animal situation completely handled. And by the way, when you arrive in Georgia, you get a small bottle of wine. Because I don't know if you know this, but Georgia is where the oldest evidence of winemaking was found. So Georgians pride themselves on winemaking. So you literally do get a bottle of wine as you arrive at the airport and go through customs saying, "Welcome to the home of wine."
That's great. But what did you want your readers to take away in terms of thinking about the wars and what the country has survived or what you have survived?
I wanted to end up in a hopeful place. That despite war and displacement and the trauma that causes, it is possible to go home again, and reconcile yourself with that trauma and be okay with it and live on.
Did you feel an urgency to write this book now?
I've been writing this book for a long time, since 2014-ish, 2015-ish. I think that's mostly because I have a day job, quite a demanding day job. So I could only write in the evenings and weekends. So I do wonder sometimes how long it would have taken to write full time. So there was no urgency. I wasn't trying to fit in with any kind of world events going on at the time. So the Ukraine war happened around the time I was querying agents at that point, and the war in Ukraine started. Unfortunately, made the novel more topical, but I don't think there's ever been a point in history where there hasn't been a war somewhere in the world. So this is always topical, I'm afraid. So yeah.
Did you find that as you started querying agents, people were really pushing this book because of the war in Ukraine? Were they really stressing that with you?
I tended to avoid the ones that wanted to stress that, to be honest, because I wanted the book to stand up on its own merits, because it really isn't a cashing in, so to speak. It's about more than the conflict itself. It's about the characters.
I really didn't think this was about, a war of the moment, that this really was about returning to the country you no longer recognize and, what you have called the invisible private toll that all wars take on those
Yeah.
fortunate enough to survive them. I mean, that's what it was about. It's a universal story in that sense. I'm Rachel Barenbaum. You're listening to Check This Out on NHPR. My guest today is Leo Vardiashvili, and we are talking about his debut novel, Hard by a Great Forest. Let's circle back, Leo, to your day job. So I understand you are a tax advisor. How does that work? Are there transferable skills? Are they things that those two jobs share, writing and tax advising?
If you asked me before I started writing, I would have said 100% no. There's nothing, they're not related at all. But having given it some thought and having finished the book, I realized that I learned a lot from my day job. As a tax advisor, you have to take huge masses of information and kind of boil them down and edit them down until just the essence remains. And that's what you give to the client as your advice. It needs to be crystal clear, very understandable, very easy to read. So doing that to my own rambling draft that I wrote 2 nights ago and editing that down to its essence is very transferable. It's very useful.
Tell us more about the writing process.
The writing process itself was very enjoyable, even if I was doing it tired and after work. It's what I would have done with my spare time anyway. So who needs spare time, right? So that's what I did. It was my first kind of real attempt to write something and try and go through the whole process of getting it published.
I also want to ask about writing and talking about your grandmother in this process. You shared with us and talked before about how you left your grandmother behind, or she was not able to join you as you went to London, and she passed away while you were gone. And Saba, your character in the book, left his mother, left without her, and lost her while he was gone. And I wanted to ask you about the experience of writing about that loss, and did the book help with that?
I feel like at times it felt like a little bit of self therapy, writing about these themes. Um, Certainly in the early drafts, where the novel sounded more like a misery memoir than anything else. I think that's where I got most of the therapy benefits out of it. And then I started writing an actual fictional novel for real. It certainly helped me make sense of it. Just the sheer act of putting it down on the page where it makes sense in sentences is a way of therapy, I think.
And when people put this book down, when they're done with it, what do you want them to be thinking about?
That's a good question. I want them to be left with a sense of hope for Saba, that he hasn't gone through this adventure for no reason, that there are good things ahead of him. So I didn't want it to be a depressing read, even though it deals with serious topics. There's light at the end of the tunnel, and that's what I wanted to be the kind of the takeaway from the book.
I think you achieved that. It was heavy, but it was not dark because you put so much hope and love in there. I want to go back for a minute to the voices. You can see that they really stayed with me, and I'm still thinking about them. I think we all have voices in our head, people from the past or maybe regrets, ways that we try to relive things that didn't go the way we wanted them to go. How do you think about them in terms of your characters, but also as a writer, as fuel for writing?
Well, you're right in that a lot of people have, well, I wouldn't call them voices, but it may be something like a voice in your head of you know how you sometimes relive an argument with someone over and over in your head, or someone important to you that you kind of talk to in the back of your mind. I had that with my grandmother and my uncle for the most part. When I found myself complaining about things in the UK, it was almost like I'd hear them respond to me and say, "Look, you're in the UK. You have a roof over your head. There's electricity. There's gas, which weren't guaranteed things in Georgia at the time we left. So quit complaining, just get on with it." So it's that little voice in the back of our mind, and just extending that a little bit.
And I'm imagining these, I'm calling them voices, but you're right. Maybe they're not voices. They are more memories or regrets or lessons that you've learned. Have they helped you stay the course as a writer?
Absolutely, yeah, 100%. Yeah, my grandma's voice, if we want to call it that, was with me throughout. She's in the dedication to the novel, or the acknowledgements at least. Um, but I'd hear her voice all the time telling me to stop being lazy and start doing some work. That happened all the time. She was a very strict grandmother, by the way. One of the things I remember most is she would make me do maths homework by the window where I could see my friends playing in the yard, but I couldn't go join them until I finished my maths homework. So she was very strict and formidable.
I'm Rachel Barenbaum. You're listening to Check This Out on NHPR. And my guest today is Leo Vardiashvili. He is the author of the debut novel, Hard by a Great Forest. We're going to launch into my last set of questions, which are around writing life. And I would love to hear a little bit about its early days for this book. It's just on the edge of coming out. What kind of reception are you hearing and feeling?
I don't really have a frame of reference, as most debut writers don't. Um, but the reviews that I'm getting seem to all be positive. People are connecting with the book in a way that I only dreamed would be possible. Um, Nodar, especially, has got a fan following now. Some people are saying that he steals the novel. So, yeah, I'm just trying to drink it in and make sure I enjoy it as much as possible.
Is there anything that's surprising you about the way that people are talking about the book? When I publish a book, I think we're going to talk about X, right? And I think we're going to talk about this character and this context. And then sometimes I sit down for an interview and, we're all the way over here, something that I didn't even think
Yeah,
about. Is there anything that is surprising you in the way that people are talking about this book?
it's a pleasant surprise, is the only one I can think of, is that it's not, the conversation is not always centered about the dark topics of the war and the displacement. That's certainly a part of it. But in these interviews, like with you, we do end up talking about escaped zoo animals and funny taxi drivers, and all sorts of lighter moments. And that's been a pleasant surprise. It always worried me that I'd written a really depressing book. So that's I guess, to answer your question, that's the surprise that I've had. So it's a pleasant surprise.
And what was the hardest part about getting this book published?
Getting it written, I suppose, was the hardest part, because it was done in fits and starts. The day job, as you can imagine, is quite demanding. Often takes up weekends as well. Um, so getting it finished and to a stage where I could send it out, was the most difficult part. It kind of took a life of its own as soon as I got an agent interested in it. It kind of almost flew off the rails at that point, which was quite a nice surprise.
Explain what you mean by that.
Well, I met my agent. Her name is Sarah O'Keefe. Um, she This happened to be just before the London Book Fair. I didn't plan it that way. I just happened to send it out early in the year. By the time she got around to it, it was the London Book Fair was 2 weeks away, and her proposal to me was, "Look, we've got 2 weeks to tighten up the draft. I'll give you some notes, but then I plan to take it to the book fair and see what I can do with it there." So within the space of 2 weeks, I was kind of heavily editing the book, changing bits. All of a sudden, she went to the London Book Fair, and in the next 3 or 4 days, it had been preempted by three publishers, um, which is going from 0 to 60 in half a second. I really wasn't ready for it. I thought I was asleep and dreaming.
What does that mean, it was preempted?
So preempted is when a publisher sees, your manuscript, and they want to take it off the market. So they don't want any other publishers to see it. So they make an offer there and then, to take your manuscript off the table, so to speak.
Wow, and
So
you
it's,
got
it's quite a compliment.
and you got three of those offers.
I've got three of those literally within days of each other. Honestly, I walking around pinching myself to this day. I don't know how it happened. And since then, it's been 13 publishers have picked it up since then. So, I mean, I'm still convinced sometimes that I might wake up and this might have all been a dream.
Amazing. 13 publishers around the world, meaning it's being translated and published by
Correct. Yeah.
one publisher in each country.
Including Georgia, actually, which was I was very happy about that.
That was my next question for you. Will it be published in Georgia?
Sorry.
Will it be translated?
Yeah, it will be translated into Georgian, and I can get all my relatives off my back and I just give them a copy.
Are you the translator?
No, absolutely not. My Georgian is not that good.
But I bet you're going to have some really careful notes for that translator.
I am actually going back and forth with the editor right now to make sure the Georgian version is correct. Because obviously, if you think about it, the Georgian version doesn't need as much explaining of things as carefully as it would for the Western reader. So yeah, in that process at the moment.
Well, congratulations. That is a huge success, and that is an amazing story. Just very exciting.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So what advice do you have for new writers? I mean, most people do not have this journey, to be clear to my listeners, right? This is an amazing book and an amazing journey. But at the end of the day, writers are still just sitting by themselves in front of their computer. So what kind of advice do you have for writers, Leo?
A lot of the time, or 90% of the time of writing this, I felt like a crazy person writing in a vacuum. Not interacting with anyone, just writing. And the advice that I got from my dad is the one I'd like to pass on, which is make sure you finish what you're writing. Whatever it is, whether it's a short story, a poem, or a novel, make sure you finish it. Because if you don't, all you're doing is you're learning how to begin things and then just abandon them. But if you get through to the end, it doesn't matter how bad you think it is, you've gone through the whole process of starting it, finishing it, looking at the finished product and going, well, okay, I learned something there.
That's great advice. Thank you. It's an amazing experience for me to be able to talk to a writer who's been through this process of, being preempted, translated, all this happening while you have your day job, because so many writers sit dreaming of that happening, and writers face so much rejection. Right? And so to see that sometimes it works out is very heartening.
Yeah, maybe that's something I should mention, is that I have a stack of 40 plus rejections for this novel. So I don't want it to sound like I sent it off to 2 agents and got both of them interested. I literally queried everyone in the UK and got rejected. In one case, twice by the same agent. So it was a long, painful journey to get an agent even, and that's where the journey ends, is after you get an agent. So yeah, it wasn't an instant kind of, well done, you made it, Leo.
And then you still also worked with your editor, right? And went through many drafts and many iterations of the book.
I did, and no one warned me about that.
How long did you work with your editor for after this book sold?
So primarily I was working with the US editor, oddly enough, who was Sarah McGrath at Riverhead Books. I think we went through about 5 or 6 drafts, and I had the same reaction each time she sent me her notes, which was just instantly push the keyboard away from me and say, she's completely misunderstood what I'm trying to say. I'm not making any of these changes. No. And then having slept on it for a day, I'll come back to my computer in the morning and I'll go, you know what? She's absolutely right. Damn it, she's absolutely right. This needs to change. This needs to change. And in the end, it's such a rewarding process because all you're doing is making your work better. And that's what she's helping you do.
And that leaves us with your amazing debut novel, Hard by a Great Forest. Leo Vardiashvili, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Rachel. It's been so much fun.
It's been such a pleasure talking to you. I look forward to staying in touch and reading more. I'm hoping there's more coming. Is there?
There is more coming.
All right. I can't wait. You've been listening to Check This Out, a new literary series, which is a partnership between New Hampshire Public Radio and the Howe Library in Hanover, New Hampshire. We dive deeply into the works of emerging and diverse authors you may not have discovered yet. Our producers today are Jared Jenish, Megan Coleman, and NHPR's Emily Quirk. The Howe Library Director is Ruby Simon. NHPR's Program Director is Emily Quirk. The show is sponsored by the Jack and Dorothy Byrne Foundation, the Howe Library Corporation, and the novel Holding On to Nothing, which comes out in paperback in May, from novelist Elizabeth Childs Shelburne. I'm Rachel Barenbaum, and I'll be back next week at this time with more conversations. Remember to go to your local library and check out all the books you hear about here and love. I'll see you next time.